Good evening and welcome to Global Lens News. I'm Sadia Afzal. In war, clarity matters, strategy matters, words matter. But what happens when the message keeps changing? During his confrontation with Iran, Donald Trump didn't just fight a geopolitical battle. He created a narrative that often seemed to contradict itself. At times, he insisted that United States was not seeking regime change in Iran. A limited objective, he said: prevent nuclear weapons, maintain control, avoid another endless war. And yet, almost in the same breath, the message would shift. Why wouldn't there be regime change? Two ideas moving in opposite directions, sometimes within days, and sometimes within the same speech. As tensions escalated, so did the confusion. Trump would claim progress, declare success, suggest the conflict was nearing its end, and then almost immediately warn of further strikes, broader operations, and continued pressure. Was the war ending or expanding? The answer depended on when you asked. Then came one of the most controversial claims, that regime change in Iran had effectively already occurred. But reality on the ground told a different story. Yes, key figures inside Iran's leadership had been eliminated. Yes, parts of the command structure had been disrupted, but the system itself remained intact. Power didn't disappear, it shifted. New figures rose to replace the old ones. The ideology didn't change. The structure didn't collapse. The state didn't fall. In fact, in many ways, the leadership that emerged appeared just as hardline, if not more so. So, what does regime change really mean in that context? If the same system continues under new leadership, is it change or just continuity under pressure? The question was never clearly answered, and it wasn't the only contradiction. Trump's stance toward Western allies followed a similar pattern. At times, he dismissed them entirely. He said, "We don't need anybody," a message of independence, strength, control. But then, when the realities of global conflict set in, when securing oil routes, maintaining regional stability, and managing escalation became more complex, the tone shifted. Suddenly, cooperation mattered. Support was expected. And when that support didn't arrive quickly enough, the rhetoric changed again. Allies became liabilities, then obligations, then targets of criticism. Organizations like NATO were described in sharply different terms depending on the moment. Either unnecessary or essential, weak or strategically important. The inconsistency wasn't subtle, it was constant. The same pattern appeared in the broader strategy toward Iran. One moment, there were signals of diplomacy, hints that talks could resume, that negotiation remained possible. The next moment, military action intensified. Strikes were authorized, threats escalated. Was this pressure meant to force Iran to the table, or was it the beginning of a deeper, longer conflict? Even those inside the administration struggled to interpret the direction. Because the strategy seemed to evolve in real time, sometimes speech by speech, sometimes post by post. And that unpredictability raised a larger question. Was that deliberate? Trump has long embraced unpredictability as a negotiating tactic. The idea that if no one can anticipate your next move, you hold the advantage. Supporters argued this kept adversaries off balance, and critics argued it created unnecessary risk, especially in a conflict where miscalculation could have global consequences. Because in geopolitics, ambiguity can be powerful, but it can also be dangerous. And nowhere was that tension more visible than in one of the world's most critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. At times, Trump spoke about asserting control over it, framing it as something that United States could dominate, even jokingly referring to it as the Strait of Trump, a symbolic claim of power, control, ownership. But the reality was far more complicated. Geographically, the strait sits along Iran's coastline. Militarily, Iran has long invested in the ability to disrupt or control traffic through it, using naval forces, missiles, and asymmetric tactics. In practical terms, it remains an area where Iran holds significant influence, so the contrast becomes clear. On one hand, rhetoric suggesting dominance, renaming, controlling, and redefining one of the world's most strategic waterways. On the other hand, a reality where that same waterway remains deeply contested and heavily influenced by Iran itself. Another example of the gap between message and circumstance. Meanwhile, on the ground in Iran, the reality remained far more stable than the rhetoric suggested. The leadership structure, though damaged, continued to function. The state remained in control. The system endured. There was no clear collapse, no visible transition to a new political order. Despite declarations of transformation, Iran remained fundamentally the same political entity. And that gap between words and reality became impossible to ignore. Even Iran itself pushed back against the narrative, rejecting claims of a new regime and framing them as disconnected from facts on the ground. Which brings us back to the central issue. In a conflict like this, messaging isn't just communication, it's strategy. It shapes how allies respond, how enemies react, how the public understands what's happening. And when that messaging shifts constantly, when it contradicts itself, it creates uncertainty, not just outside the country, but inside it. So, what do these contradictions ultimately represent? A calculated strategy built on unpredictability or a lack of clear direction? The answer may depend on perspective, but the impact is harder to debate. Because throughout the Iran conflict, the narrative itself became unstable. Regime change claimed, denied, redefined. War, ending, continuing, escalating. Allies dismissed, needed, criticized. Global choke points symbolically claimed, yet strategically contested. Each message colliding with the last. And in the end, the conflict wasn't just fought with weapons, sanctions, or diplomacy. It was fought with words. Words that didn't always align. Words that didn't always match reality. Words that sometimes raised more questions than they answered. Because in modern warfare, consistency can be power, but contradiction, that can reshape the entire battlefield. This is Sadia Afzal for Global Lens News.